I was in surgery for 4 hours. When I came out, the nurse told me everything had gone well. I had no reason to think otherwise. My daughter was sitting in the waiting room when they wheeled me to recovery. She held my hand and told me she loved me. What she didn't tell me, what I wouldn't find out for 11 more days, was what she had done while I was unconscious. By the time I was awake again, the house I had paid off for over 30 years had someone else's name on the title. That name was my daughter's. And the worst part wasn't the house. The worst part was what came after I confronted her. My name is Margaret. I am 61 years old and I spent 32 years working as a registered nurse at Westmead Hospital in Western Sydney. I raised 2 children in a house in Penrith. My husband passed 13 years ago, and I stayed in that house because it was home. After he died, I made a promise to myself. I would finish paying off the mortgage. I would own something that could never be taken from me. 7 years later, I made that final payment. I remember sitting at the kitchen table holding a confirmation letter. I cried for the first time in years. My daughter, Lauren, was 30 when her father died. She was devastated. We held each other through that period in a way I will always be grateful for. She moved back home for 6 months afterwards, and we rebuilt something that went beyond mother and daughter. We became, I thought, genuinely close friends. After she moved out and married, we spoke every day. She was 15 minutes away. She had a key to my house. I was godmother to her first child. When I was diagnosed with severe arthritis in my hip 3 years ago, she was the first person I called. She came over that same afternoon. As my mobility deteriorated, Lauren took on more of my affairs. Grocery shopping, driving me to appointments, eventually managing my banking when it became difficult to get out. She suggested I give her power of attorney 18 months before the surgery. I thought it was sensible, a practical measure for an older woman living alone. I remember the solicitor explaining what the document meant. Lauren was sitting beside me, nodding at all the right moments. I signed without hesitation. That afternoon she took me for coffee in Penrith. We talked about the grandchildren and her garden and nothing in particular. I drove home feeling well looked after. That memory sits in me differently now. The surgery was booked for March. A full hip replacement. I was nervous, but the surgeon was experienced and Lauren said she would be there for every step. I packed my hospital bag the night before. Lauren came over and helped me, laughing about the hospital gown, making sure I knew she'd be in that waiting room. She hugged me at the door when she left. Held on a little longer than usual. I remember thinking she was just worried about me. I should have paid more attention to that hug. The morning of the surgery, she drove me to the hospital herself. She helped me through admissions and sat with me until they called me through. She was still there when they took me to the prep room. She squeezed my hand at the door and said, "I'll be right here when you wake up." The anesthetist counted me down and I went under thinking about her face, believing I was in good hands. She was there when I woke up. She brought flowers and stayed for 2 hours. She told the nurse I was her mum and she wanted updates. She came back every day of the 4 days I was in hospital. She brought home cooked meals and helped me practice walking the ward with the physiotherapist. When they discharged me, she drove me home, made up the spare room so I wouldn't have to climb the stairs, and stocked the fridge. For 11 days after the surgery, everything felt exactly as it should have been. Then the letter arrived. It was a letter from the land titles office. I almost didn't open it, assuming it was something routine, something administrative. My name was on the envelope. The document inside referenced my property, my address, the house in Penrith that I had paid off 7 years before. The name on the title was not mine. I read it 3 times. Then I sat down on the kitchen floor, which I had not done in years, and I read it a 4th time. Lauren's full name was printed on the transfer document. The date of transfer was the same day as my surgery. The timestamp was early afternoon. I called her immediately. She didn't answer. I called again. She picked up on the 4th ring and I could hear the children in the background. I told her what I was reading. There was a pause that lasted too long before she said, "Mom, let me explain." She told me it was a protection measure. She said she had done it to keep the property safe from any complications that might arise from the surgery. I asked her what complications she meant. She said she had read about estate disputes and she just wanted to be certain the house was protected. She spoke calmly, gently, like she was explaining something to someone who was confused and slightly unwell. I remember thinking, she has practiced this. I told her I wanted my name back on the title by the end of the week. She said she understood completely and she would sort it out. She did not sort it out. 3 days later I called her again. She was busy, the baby was sick, she had a work deadline. She would call me back tomorrow. She did not call me back tomorrow. The following week I called her husband, David. He told me Lauren had spoken to a solicitor and everything was fine. He seemed very uncomfortable on the phone. I asked him which solicitor. He said he'd have Lauren send me the details. She never sent them. I checked my savings account that same night. My transaction history showed a withdrawal pattern. I had never authorized 4 transfers over a 10-week period before the surgery. Not large amounts. Never enough to trigger an alert. 200 here, 400 there, 700 once. All to an account I did not recognize. My stomach told me something my mind did not want to accept. I rang the bank the next morning. They told me the transfers had been authorized by the account holder, which, under the power of attorney, included Lauren. The bank manager's voice was careful and professional. He told me I had options. He said it very gently, the way you say something to someone who already knows. I started writing things down. Dates, amounts, phone calls, what was said, what wasn't said. A habit from 30 years of nursing. If it isn't documented, it didn't happen. Lauren came over that Friday with the children. She made tea. She asked how my hip was healing. She did not mention the title or the transfers once. I watched her in my kitchen. Her kitchen, technically, according to the paperwork now. I did not say anything that day. I needed to be certain before I spoke again. My younger sister, Carol, came over that weekend. I showed her the letter and the bank statements. She sat very still for a long time before she spoke. Carol said, "Margaret, you need a solicitor, not Lauren's solicitor, your own." I did not sleep that night. I kept returning to things I had dismissed. The month before the surgery, Lauren had asked me if I had a will. I told her yes. She asked where I kept it. I told her it was in the filing cabinet in the study. She nodded and said she was just making sure she knew where things were. In case. 2 weeks before the surgery, she borrowed my phone charger and was in the study for longer than I would have expected. I thought nothing of it at the time. She had also asked, in passing, which bank held my accounts. I told her. She said she was just keeping a record for her own peace of mind. I had interpreted every one of those moments as care, as love, as a daughter making sure her mother was prepared. That was what made it so effective. She had not acted rashly. She had been patient and methodical and careful. She had built the foundation for what she did months before she did it. There was a moment in maybe 3 weeks after the letter arrived when she sat with me in this kitchen and said, "Mom, I did this for you." She looked directly at me. Her voice was steady. Her eyes did not waver. For a brief moment I wondered if somehow I had misunderstood the entire situation. That is how it works. When someone who loves you tells you they did something terrible because they love you, part of you wants to believe them. I did not believe her. But I understood, in that moment, exactly how long she had been preparing for that conversation. The week after, I hired a solicitor. I did not tell Lauren. My solicitor's name was Anthony. He was recommended by Carol's husband, a retired police officer. Anthony had handled property disputes for 20 years. I brought the title transfer document, the bank statements, the power of attorney agreement, and my handwritten notes from the past 3 weeks. He read everything slowly. When he finished, he looked up and said, "This is a serious matter, Margaret. I want to be very clear with you about that." He explained that while the power of attorney had granted Lauren legal authority, the scope of that authority was subject to challenge, particularly regarding property transfer. He said the key question was whether the transfer was a legitimate protective act or a deliberate misappropriation of a vulnerable person's assets. He used the word deliberate carefully. I asked him what our options were. He said we could begin with a formal letter of demand or proceed directly to a tribunal application. We had grounds for both. I went home and sat in the kitchen for a long time. The house was quiet in a way I hadn't felt in months. If I had known what I was about to find next, I would have poured myself something stronger than tea. Anthony called me the following morning. He had done a title search. Lauren had not just transferred the house into her name, she had taken out a loan against it. The property had been used as collateral for a personal loan of $62,000, arranged through a private lender. The funds had been drawn down 4 days after the surgery. I could not speak for a moment. Anthony waited. $62,000 against a house I had paid off, against the one thing that could not be taken from me. I asked him who the lender was. He read me the name. I did not recognize it at first. Then I remembered it was the surname of Lauren's husband's university friend. The lender and my son-in-law had been at university together. David knew. David had to have known. Anthony said we needed to move quickly. The longer the loan sat against the property, the more complex the recovery would become. He filed an urgent application with the NSW Civil and Administrative Tribunal within the week. I signed everything he put in front of me with my hands shaking. Lauren called me the night after the application was filed. Someone must have told her it was coming. Her voice had changed, the gentleness was gone. She said I was trying to destroy her family. She said I had misunderstood everything. She said she needed the money to pay a debt that would have hurt all of us. A debt. For the first time she acknowledged the loan. For the first time she admitted she had used my house as currency for a problem she had not told me about. I asked her what the debt was. She would not tell me. She was crying now, but it did not sound like the crying I remembered from when she was young. I ended the call. Carol came over that same evening. We sat together without speaking for a long time. I kept trying to remember when Lauren had changed, looking for the moment where the person I raised became someone I no longer recognized. I could not find it, and that frightened me more than anything else. 3 weeks into the tribunal process, Anthony discovered the identity of the solicitor who had processed the original title transfer. His name was James Hartley. James Hartley was Lauren's boyfriend before David. They had dated for 3 years in their mid-20s. He now had a small private conveyancing practice in Blacktown. Anthony told me this with a measured tone, the same way you deliver difficult information to someone who needs facts more than comfort. The solicitor who had processed the removal of my house from my name had been in a relationship with my daughter a decade earlier. He knew exactly who I was. I remember where I was sitting when he told me. I remember the particular quality of light in the room. Some details you do not choose to remember, they simply stay. My hands would not stop shaking even when I pressed them flat against the kitchen table. That was the moment I understood this had never been impulsive. None of us had been. Anthony subpoenaed the conveyancing records. When they came back, we found that Hartley had prepared the transfer documents 2 weeks before my surgery date. 2 weeks before, while I was still mobile, while I was still in my own kitchen making Lauren tea and thanking her for how much she cared. The paperwork had been sitting in a drawer, waiting for the hour I was unconscious. He had also prepared a second document, a draft will amendment, never executed, that would have moved my savings account directly into a trust managed by Lauren. It hadn't been filed, but it had been prepared. Anthony said this was significant. It showed intent and scope far beyond what had already been done. There was more. The bank produced records showing Lauren's account had received, over 19 months, 14 individual transfers from my savings. Not just the 4 I had originally found. 14 transfers. Spread thin and deliberately timed. The total was $31,000. Gone over a period I had partially known about and largely trusted completely. $31,000 from a retired nurse's savings. From a woman who had worked 40-hour weeks for 3 decades because she did not want to be a burden to anyone. I sat with that number for a long time. I asked myself the question I had been avoiding for weeks. Did I cause this? Did I give her too much access and assume that love was protection enough? I thought about the morning I signed power of attorney, the solicitor explaining it all while Lauren sat beside me with that patient, careful expression. I had read the document. I understood what I was signing. I made the decision with full awareness. And still she found a way through it that I had never imagined. Anthony told me David had been formally notified of the tribunal proceedings. His solicitor responded within 48 hours. David was separating from Lauren's legal situation. My son-in-law was distancing himself from my daughter. That told me everything about how serious this had become and how long David had likely known. The grandchildren. I thought about the grandchildren every single day throughout those months. 2 small girls who had nothing to do with any of this. That was its own kind of grief. A mutual friend, someone Lauren and I had both known for 15 years, contacted me during the tribunal. She wanted me to know she had heard Lauren's version of events. Lauren was telling people I had gifted her the house, that it had been a planned transfer we had discussed together, and I was now having second thoughts after a disagreement. The story was so complete, so detailed, so entirely plausible that I understood Lauren hadn't improvised it. She had built that narrative long before I found the letter. I stopped answering calls from people I could not be certain of. I became very still and very focused. The tribunal hearing was held on a Tuesday in July. I wore the same clothes I had worn to my husband's funeral service, navy blue, understated, entirely forgettable. Lauren attended with her own solicitor. She did not look at me when she walked in. The presiding member reviewed the evidence across 2 sessions. Anthony presented the timeline, the preparation dates, the prior relationship between Lauren and Hartley, and the full transfer history. Lauren's solicitor argued the transfer was a legitimate protective measure carried out within the scope of the power of attorney. He was composed. Lauren had briefed him well. I gave my statement. I spoke for 14 minutes. I did not raise my voice once. At one point, Lauren looked at me directly across the room. I met her eyes. Neither of us looked away for a long moment. I have known her face since before she was born. I have watched it through every stage of her life, and in that moment I could not find the person I had raised. That was the hardest part of the whole process. Not the house, not the money. That moment. The member did not deliberate for long. The preparation timeline 2 weeks prior to surgery was decisive. It established premeditation rather than a protective response to a medical event. The title transfer was ordered to be reversed. The loan against the property was to be invalidated pending further proceedings against Hartley. The $31,000 was to be repaid. I heard the ruling from very far away, like a sound arriving through water. Lauren left without speaking to me. Her solicitor nodded professionally in my direction. Anthony put his hand briefly on my shoulder. I walked out into the car park and stood in the sunshine for several minutes and felt absolutely nothing at all. Carol met me outside. She said, "Is it over?" I said, "The legal part is." The Hartley matter was referred separately to the Law Society. He surrendered his practicing certificate 14 months later. David finalized the separation from Lauren within 3 months. I learned about it through a mutual friend. He never contacted me directly. I did not know how to feel about that. Coming home to the house after the ruling felt nothing like I imagined it would. I had thought it would feel like reclaiming something. It felt like walking into a crime scene. Every room held a version of Lauren. The kitchen where she had helped me pack for hospital. The spare room she had set up for my recovery. The filing cabinet in the study. I did not change anything straight away. I just walked through and let myself notice what was different about being in there now. Quite a few people from the neighborhood had heard pieces of the story. Not the accurate version pieces. Some were supportive. Some were noticeably quiet. One woman I had coffee with monthly for 11 years told me she preferred not to get involved in family matters. I have not heard from her since. A man from down the street, as someone I barely knew, left a bag of vegetables from his garden on my front step with a note that simply said, "We're thinking of you." That note stayed on my fridge for a long time. The repayment of the $31,000 was court-ordered, but Lauren had almost nothing accessible. It would come through a structured arrangement that Anthony would monitor monthly. I was not going to see that money returned quickly. I understood that. I chose not to spend my energy on it. What I spent my energy on instead was the smallest, most concrete things. Updating the power of attorney document, reviewing the will, meeting with a different solicitor to understand exactly what protections I now had. I spent 6 hours one morning going through every document in the filing cabinet, reading things I had signed without really reading them. I found 3 more authorizations I did not remember giving. None of them had been used, but they had been prepared and signed and placed somewhere Lauren had access to. I had my solicitor revoke each one. My son Lauren's brother, Michael, called from Perth when he heard what had happened. He had kept his distance from the legal process at Lauren's request. He said to me, "Mum, I knew something was wrong. I should have said something earlier." He was crying. I told him it was not his fault. I meant it. But something changed between Michael and me after that conversation, in a way I'm still learning to understand. There was also what it did to my body. 3 months of sustained fear and legal process, on top of recovering from a full hip replacement. My GP told me my blood pressure had risen significantly. He adjusted my medication. He said, "Whatever you're carrying right now, put as much of it down as you can." I told him I was working on it. There were nights I could not sleep, not from grief exactly, but from a kind of relentless mental replaying and going back through conversation after conversation looking for the moment I had missed. You cannot find that moment. It is not there. Because people who plan this carefully do not leave visible moment. That is the nature of it. Eventually, I stopped looking. The grandchildren. I had not seen them since 2 weeks before the tribunal hearing. Lauren had stopped the contact without explanation, and I did not pursue it during the legal process. 3 months after the ruling, Lauren sent me a brief message saying the girls missed me and asking if I would consider meeting them at the park. I sat with that message for 2 days. I went to the park. The girls ran to me. They had no idea anything had happened. I held them for a long time and did not say a single word about their mother. I will not punish children for what their parent did. That was a decision I made very early, and I have kept it. Lauren sat on a bench about 20 meters away. We did not speak. After an hour, she called the girls, then they left. I drove home and sat in the driveway for longer than I should have. Several months later, I received a letter from Lauren's new solicitor, not a legal action, but a request to discuss a private repayment arrangement outside the court-ordered schedule. I showed it to Anthony. He advised me we were under no obligation to respond. I chose not to. Some people expected me to eventually forgive her publicly, to reach her reconciliation of the kind that resolves things for everyone around you rather than for yourself. I did not feel that obligation. I felt something else instead. A very quiet shift. Difficult to name precisely. The house was mine again. On paper, in law, in reality. And yet I would have to decide over time what it meant to live in it now. I started small. New locks. Not because I thought Lauren would come back. Because I needed the physical action of it. Then I painted the hallway. A color I had always liked and never chosen because we had compromised on something else when we first moved in. Then I rearranged the living room. Moved the armchair back to where I had always wanted it before my husband preferred the other configuration. It sounds like nothing. It wasn't nothing. I was reclaiming the house one small decision at a time, in a way that had nothing to do with paperwork and everything to do with something I cannot quite articulate. Like learning to sleep in a room again after something bad happened in it. A year out from the tribunal ruling, I returned to work. Part-time, 3 days a week, in a community health clinic in Penrith. Not because I had to, because I chose to. I had forgotten what it was like to spend a day being useful in a way that had nothing to do with my personal life. I had missed it more than I had realized. The people at the clinic did not know my story. They knew me as a retired nurse returning to part-time work. That was exactly what I wanted. I had also joined a small financial literacy group, something Carol had suggested, for women in later life navigating legal and financial decisions on their own. Meeting women who had experienced similar things handled by similar means changed something in me. Not anger. Something more like clarity. I no longer felt naive for having trusted Lauren. I felt, instead, like someone who had encountered something deliberate and survived it. Those are not the same thing. I updated my will. The house goes to a charitable trust upon my death. I made that decision early in the recovery period, and I have not changed my mind since. Lauren is not included. Michael is. But the decision about the house was mine to make, and I made it based on what I now know rather than what I had once assumed. I had one final conversation with Lauren face to face in the car park of a shopping centre in Parramatta. She had requested it. I agreed to half an hour. She told me she had been in serious gambling debt, that it had been going on for 3 years before the surgery, that she had been too ashamed to ask for help. She said she had panicked, that she had told herself it was temporary, that she had intended to reverse everything once the debt was cleared. I listened to all of it without interrupting her. I believed the gambling debt was real. I believed she had been in genuine crisis. I believed that some version of what she described had actually happened inside her. What I could not bridge was the gap between that crisis and the choice she made, between being frightened and choosing to take from someone who had never said no to her. I told her I understood she had been in trouble. I told her I was not able to offer what she was asking for, which was, I think, some form of absolution. She cried. I sat with that. I did not cry. I told her I loved her, because I did, and that I was not going to disappear from her daughters' lives, because I was not. And then I drove home. That was the last time we spoke directly. She sends messages occasionally. I read them. I reply briefly when the subject is the grandchildren. It is not what I would have chosen for my life, but it is what is true now, and I have learned to sit with what is true rather than what I had wanted. I keep the letter from the land titles office, the one I read 4 times on the kitchen floor in a filing cabinet in the study. Not because I need it, because I want to remember what it felt like to find it, not the pain. The moment of clarity that followed the pain. The moment where I understood that I had a choice about what happened next, that the choice was entirely mine. I am 63 now. The hip is well. The clinic is 3 days a week. The garden is better than it has been in years. Carol comes for Sunday lunch most weeks. Michael calls from Perth every Saturday morning without fail. The grandchildren came for school holidays last month, and we baked and went to the park. I do not need very much to be well. I have learned through all of this more thoroughly than I could have managed any other way. There's one thing I tell the women in the financial literacy group when we talk about power of attorney. One thing I tell them plainly and without softening it. I say trust is not the same as documentation, and documentation is not the same as protection. You must have both. They must work together, and you must review them regularly. I say the people who take from you are almost never strangers. I say it quietly. They write it down. I still live in the house. Some months I think about selling it and starting somewhere entirely new. Some months I am glad I stayed. There are mornings I wake up and make coffee and stand at the kitchen window looking out at the street and feel nothing more complicated than gratitude for the light. Those mornings are becoming more frequent. I am not restored to who I was. I do not think that was ever going to be possible, and I am no longer sure it was what I wanted. I am someone else now, quieter, more deliberate. It took everything she did, all of it, to teach me that the house was never what I was actually protecting. She took the house. I kept the truth, and the truth outlasts everything. Disclaimer: this story is a fictional narrative created for storytelling and entertainment purposes. All characters, events, and facilities depicted are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to real people, places, or businesses is purely coincidental. Produced with AI writing assistance.